the first kings of the 11th dynasty, who all went by the name of Intef, sometimes styled themselves as king of Upper and Lower Egypt, even though they actually controlled nothing more than the countryside around their capital city. But what began as aspiration slowly became reality, as one ruler after another pushed the boundary further and further north. Finally, sometime after the year 2060 BC, Intef III's successor Mentuhotep I succeeded in conquering the north once again and reuniting all Egypt under his rule. With him, the Middle Kingdom began.
The Middle Kingdom 206-01-782b.
By comparison with the absolute divinity of the king at the height of the Old Kingdom and the absolute royal totalitarianism which prevailed in that era, the kingship of the Middle Kingdom was but a shadow of its former self. The god in human form who once boasted that in the next life he would kill and eat the other gods in order to gain their power, now bowed before those gods in humble supplication. Nevertheless, the kingship remained the centerpiece of Egyptian civilization, and its power was still considerable. Following Mentuhotep I, 2 more kings reigned in succession under the same name, thereby completing the 11th dynasty. Under their rule, Egypt began to regain its former glory. The mines were reopened, the Asiatics were cleared from the delta, military expeditions struck at Libya and Nubia, ancient canals were cleared and improved, trade with the outside world was resumed, and monumental construction began anew. The Mentuhoteps also moved their capital from Iuni to a site a few miles downriver where their predecessors, the Intefs, had established their necropolis. The new capital was officially dubbed simply Wazet, after the nome which it ruled, but apparently at least some called it by the name of its most ancient and venerable holy site, the Tamt, on the west bank of the Nile, where the primordial gods of Egypt were supposed to be buried. This passed into Coptic as Geme, and ultimately into Greek as Thebes. Mentuhotep III was followed on the throne not by his own son, Mentuhotep IV, but by his vizier, Amenemhat, who is considered the founder of the 12th dynasty. Unlike the kings of the previous dynasty, who, as their names indicate, were followers of the ancient Theban war god Montu, Amenemhat and his successors were devotees of Amun, a shadowy figure whose name means the Hidden One. From this point on, Amun's fortunes were to rise along with the fortunes of Thebes. The kings of the 12th dynasty lavished foreign plunder on Amun's temples, as did their successors, until the temple complex at Thebes was the largest such structure in the world. And when, in times to come, Thebes became the capital of all Egypt, Amun, as that city's patron, accordingly became the supreme Egyptian deity, ultimately identified with Ra himself, Amun-Hat, perhaps in deliberate imitation of Menes 1,000 years earlier, established a new political capital near the boundary between Upper and Lower Egypt, about 20 miles from Memphis. To drive home the point, he gave it the name Ijtawi, Sizer of the Two Lands. To prevent further unrest on the part of the nobility, he and his successors redrew the nome boundaries and deposed or executed any nomarchs who represented a threat to centralized authority. To prevent further incursions from Asia, a comprehensive series of fortifications known as the Wall of the Prince was constructed along the eastern border between Egypt proper and the Sinai Desert. To prevent potential incursions from Nubia, Egyptian control was imposed between the First and Second Cataracts, and a series of fortresses constructed in that region as well. There were extensive trading contacts with Syria-Palestine, especially Byblos, where a number of significant Middle Kingdom artifacts have been discovered, and it is during this period that regular contact with Crete seems to have been established as well. The kings of the Middle Kingdom made a conscious effort to restore the debased artistic and architectural standards of their own era to the glorious standards of the Old Kingdom, which they saw as the golden age of Egyptian civilization. Ironically, the success of this restoration created such a vibrant and long-lasting cultural efflorescence in their own day that subsequent generations were to look to the Middle Kingdom rather than the Old as the standard for their own time. This was especially the case with the Egyptian language. As we shall see, the Egyptian of the Middle Kingdom was the standard for official usage until the Amarna era in the middle of the New Kingdom, many centuries later.
The Second Intermediate Period, 1782-1570 BC,
With the death of Amenemhat IV, the 12th dynasty ended, and once again, Egypt began to slide into anarchy. As before, the nomarchs began acting like independent princes as the central authority declined. As before, foreigners from Asia who had been quietly infiltrating Egypt all through the Middle Kingdom and even advancing to high rank within the government itself, took advantage of the situation to set up their own power bases in the Delta. This time, however, some of the Asiatics, apparently Canaanites and/or Phoenicians from Syria-Palestine, were not content with establishing minor kingdoms and ruling over their own people. Instead, operating out of their headquarters at Avaris, they sacked and occupied Memphis, seized control of Egypt almost as far south as Abydos, and allied themselves with a resurgent indigenous regime in Nubia. All that was left to the native Egyptian rulers was the territory of Upper Egypt from Abydos to Elephantine, which was ruled from Thebes by a new line of kings who later came to be reckoned as the 17th dynasty. These Semitic rulers of Lower Egypt were called by the Egyptians Hyksos, or rulers of foreign lands. The term later entered Greek as Eukuks and J or Hyksos, which is how they are usually known today. While the Hyksos made a show of adopting Egyptian culture and even Egyptian religion, with their kings calling themselves sons of Ra, as if they were native-born Egyptian rulers, the memory of their rule was abominated by later Egyptians. Manetho described in bitter detail how the Hyksos had burned our cities ruthlessly, razed to the ground the temples of the gods, and treated all the natives with a cruel hostility, massacring some and leading into slavery the wives and children of others. Whether correct or not as a factual account of the events, Manetho's description is probably an accurate reflection of how at least some Egyptians perceived the situation. Hence, it was inevitable that sooner or later there would be a rising against the occupying power, and perhaps equally inevitable that it was the Theban rulers of Upper Egypt who led it. The spark was struck by Tao Ta II around the year 1574, who, as we know from his mummy, died horribly in battle against the Hyksos. His son, Kamose, took up the fight, but also died after only a few years. After a hiatus of a decade or more, Kamose's son Amose initiated new hostilities and succeeded first in driving the Hyksos back to their capital at Avaris, then in expelling them from the country altogether. After more than a century of Hyksos domination, Egypt was once again free and united under the 18th dynasty, of which Amazes was reckoned the founder.
The New Kingdom, 1570-1070 B.C.
With the 18th dynasty, we finally arrive at the New Kingdom, the period during which the Instruction of Amenemope was written, 0.44. As we have seen, Egypt was often deeply involved in the affairs of foreign lands, not only with its immediate neighbors, such as Nubia and Libya, but with more distant realms, such as Syria-Palestine, Mesopotamia, Cyprus, Crete, and Mycenae. With the expulsion of the Hyksos, however, Egypt's foreign involvements moved to a qualitatively higher level. A century or more of domination by a foreign power rooted in Syria-Palestine had inevitably opened Egypt to foreign influences to a greater extent than at any time since the reign of Menes. It was the Hyksos who introduced into Egypt the warhorse, the chariot, and numerous other new weapons of war. It was, at least in part, the Semitic tongue of the Hyksos which introduced into the Egyptian language the large stock of Semitic vocabulary which figures so prominently in such New Kingdom texts as Amenemope. Above all, it was the Hyksos who forced Egypt to come of age as a world power by instilling in the Egyptians a determination never again to be vulnerable to foreign conquest. From now on, if the Egyptians had anything to say about it, Egypt would be the paramount power in the known world. Egyptian hegemony would be imposed by any means necessary, and Egyptian power would be projected as distantly as required to keep the Hyksos experience from ever being repeated. Ahmose himself began the restoration by carrying the battle to the Hyksos in their own homeland. Leading an Egyptian army into Palestine, he drove them from their southern fortress of Sheruhen, and thereby regained the loyalty of at least some of Egypt's former vassal states in the region. Next, he invaded Nubia. There, he suppressed the indigenous regime which had sprung up during Egypt's weakness, restored and enhanced the old Middle Kingdom fortresses, and reinstated the steady flow of gold upon which Egypt's foreign commerce depended. Things were beginning to return to normal at last. One thing which did not return to normal, however, was the prestige of the monarchy itself. The overweening hubris of the kingship, already weakened by the collapse of royal power at the end of the Old Kingdom and its reformulation on a weaker basis in the Middle Kingdom, had suffered under the Hyksos a blow from which it would never recover. Despite the impressive achievements of the early New Kingdom pharaohs in restoring the old order of things, and despite the even greater accomplishments of their successors, it was now understood all too well, certainly by those in the upper ranks of society, and quite likely even by the man in the street, that while the king might hold a divine office, he himself was but a man, like other men, subject to all the failings of human nature and the vicissitudes of fate. As a result, the true ruler of Egypt was increasingly believed to be not the all-too-fallible human king, but rather the god Amun, who acted upon the king and the rest of the state through his priesthood and its oracles. It was Amun who had chosen the king as his representative, Amun who favored the king with his blessing, and Amun who quite literally gave the king his marching orders in time of war. Hence, it was no longer enough for the king simply to be the king. In order to validate his authority, each new pharaoh had to be a worldly success and was expected to accomplish greater things than those who came before him. The stasis of the old conservatism, which had served Egypt so well for century after century, had been replaced by something new, a belief in what we would call progress, and the desire of each generation to outdo the achievements of its predecessors. The stage was now set for an economic and cultural flowering, such as even the Egypt of the Old and Middle Kingdoms had never seen. While the pharaohs of the New Kingdom inevitably looked in part to the past for guidance in reconstructing Egypt after the Hyksos debacle, they also broke much new ground. It began with Ahmose's son, Amenhotep I, who seems to have surrounded himself with an extraordinary array of poets, artists, architects, scientists, and religious visionaries. During his reign and that of his successor, Thutmose, there were radical innovations in political organization, technology, literature, and even funerary practices. It was during this same period that the huge temple complex of Amun at Thebes began to take on its final form as a rectangular, symmetric, tripartite construction, oriented on an east-west longitudinal axis, with pylons at the front gate and a darkened sanctuary at the rear. This would ultimately become the standard for subsequent generations of cult temples right down to the time of the Greek conquest, and would even make its mark on the Greco-Roman basilica and the Christian cathedral. It was also during the reigns of these two great pharaohs that a note of overt militarism and conscious imperialism first entered Egyptian history. Egypt now had a standing army. Military officers routinely held high positions in the new government, and the crown prince was given a specifically military upbringing and his own military command, so that when his time came to rule Egypt, he would be a capable warrior, ready to expand Egypt's borders still further. The pattern was set by Thutmose I, who led Egyptian forces all the way to the Fourth Cataract, deep inside Nubia, and to the banks of the Euphrates in Syria, where he erected a commemorative stela near Carchemish. Thutmose IV was succeeded by his son, Thutmose II, who followed policies similar to his father's. The same would ultimately be true of Thutmose II's son, Thutmose III, but only after a 20-year interregnum, during which the throne was usurped by Thutmose II's half-sister, Hatshepsut, while Thutmose III was kept in the background and perhaps, judging from the evidence, even in a kind of internal exile or house arrest. Hatshepsut arrayed herself with all the power of a ruling pharaoh and even with most of the associated iconography, despite its overwhelmingly masculine symbolism. Like her predecessors, she claimed to be Amun's literal daughter, conceived when the god descended in bodily form and lay with her mother, a scene which was explicitly, some might say almost pornographically, illustrated on the walls of her mortuary complex. Like her predecessors, she lavished riches and new construction upon the precincts of Amun at Thebes, including the unprecedented importation of exotic flora and fauna from the distant shores of the land of Punt in East Africa. Unlike her predecessors, however, Hatshepsut as pharaoh exhibited a devotion to Amun which was uncharacteristically intense and even obsequious. In one of her inscriptions she stated, "I did this with a loving heart for my father Amun, after I entered before his secret image of the first occasion, And after I became wise by his excellent power, I did not neglect a deed he determined. My majesty knows that he is divine. I have thus done according to his command, for he is the one who leads me. Never shall I devise projects that are not of his doing, for he it is who gives instructions. It has been plausibly suggested that behind such sentiments lay either a crass manipulation of Hatshepsut herself by the priests of Thebes, or else their tacit complicity in her own decision to seize the throne from its rightful heir. Perhaps in reality it was a bit of both, each side of the power equation using the other to its own advantage. In any case, the arrangement was not to last. 2 decades after the death of Thutmose II, Hatshepsut and her circle of advisors suddenly disappear from the historical record without the slightest indication of what happened to them, and the long-repressed Thutmose III, still waiting in the wings after all those years, immediately ascended the throne as sole ruler. Not surprisingly, he ordered the erasure of his predecessor's name from all public monuments, the desecration of her every representation in painting or statuary, and her removal from the official list of legitimate pharaohs. If indeed there had been a conspiracy by the priests of Amun to seize power using Hatshepsut as their surrogate, it had failed. And while her successors remained loyal to Amun of Thebes and continued to lavish riches upon his temples, they were also increasingly cognizant of the danger posed to royal sovereignty by an ambitious priesthood. As we shall see in time, the rivalry between the two would yield bitter fruit indeed. Thutmose III has been called the Napoleon of Egypt, for it was under his reign that Egypt's power reached its zenith. Hatshepsut had eschewed military strife, preferring to conduct her foreign policy with trading missions and peaceful economic ties. As a result, by the time Thutmose III came to power, the eastern territories amassed by the earlier New Kingdom pharaohs had begun to slip away. Egypt was now faced with a rebellion led by the last bastion of the old Hyksos coalition, the city of Kadesh on the Orontes, and backed by the growing power of the Hurrian-led Mesopotamian kingdom of Mitanni. Thutmose III made it his first priority to rectify the rapidly deteriorating situation in the east, and rectify it he did, under the banner of Amun, at whose command he claimed to have received both the throne and his mission of conquest. Thutmose III spent 17 years campaigning in the east. With each campaign, he extended his territories further afield both by land and by sea, conquering along the way a total of 350 towns and cities. Thutmose I had managed to reach the Euphrates. Thutmose III actually crossed it, using boats built in Lebanon by his own troops and hauled across the mountains on ox carts. The armies of Mitanni, who had no doubt considered the great river to be an impregnable barrier, scattered before him. Without opposition, he marched downriver and plundered the Mitanni heartland, then turned west again to capture and sack the enemy stronghold of Kadesh before crowning his victories with a royal elephant hunt. In the south, the story was the same. Nubia was conquered and pacified as far as the Fourth Cataract, and where Thutmose I had been content merely to smite the natives and return laden with booty, Thutmose III left garrisons to maintain Egyptian control, and tax collectors to systematically extract the region's wealth for Egypt's benefit. The extensive plunder which Thutmose III's army carried back to Egypt, including exotic plants and animals gathered from all over Syria for the temple gardens of Thebes, was supplemented by extensive tribute received from the Hittites, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Cypriotes, all of whom now had good reason to seek the favor of Pharaoh. Once again, Egypt was the most powerful state in the known world, and no doubt also the most feared. To drive the point home, and as a tribute to his patron deity, Thutmose III had his war annals inscribed and illustrated for all to see on the walls of the great temple of Amun at Thebes, where they remain to this day. The extensive conquests of Thutmose III left little for his successors to do in the military sphere beyond simply maintaining what had already been achieved. Both Amenhotep II and Thutmose IV were forced to make punitive expeditions into Syria and Nubia to put down minor rebellions, but the empire remained secure. Thutmose IV even concluded an alliance with troublesome Mitanni, sealing it by his marriage to a Mitanni princess. It was, however, his Egyptian wife, Mutemwiya, who gave him an heir. By the time the son of Thutmose IV ascended the throne as Amenhotep III, it was universally understood that resistance to Egyptian hegemony was futile. Egyptian economic and cultural influence extended as far afield as Crete, Mycenae, Anatolia, Cyprus, Mitanni, Assyria, Babylon, and even Yemen, while the growing power of the Hittites in Asia Minor was hemmed in by a series of mutual defense treaties between Egypt and Hadi's neighbors. The Egyptian vassals in Syria-Palestine were at peace, and only minor police actions in Nubia were required to protect the incessant flow of gold that Egypt's extensive foreign trade required. The tribute pouring in effortlessly on every side left Amenhotep III free to spend most of his long reign immersed in what has been described as Oriental sumptuousness. He filled his harem with the sisters and daughters of distant potentates and hunted wild bulls and lions by the hundreds. His prowess in both arenas was trumpeted on a series of inscribed scarabs, which were issued much like today's commemorative coins and distributed for propaganda purposes to Egypt's distant ally. Under the influence of his mother Mutemwiya and his chief wife Mutemui, a commoner named Tie, who was descended from a military family in the city of Akhmim, he became a patron of the arts. Under the guidance of his chief advisor and confidant Amenhotep the son of Hapu, he built palaces and temples on a scale to dwarf even the most monumental efforts of his predecessors. Both within the palace and outside it, the combination of sustained peace, the leisure born of prosperity, and the encounter with distant cultures gave rise to a new flowering of creativity and an excess of conspicuous consumption in every field. But with the torrent of wealth pouring into Egypt from conquest and commerce, there also came unparalleled foreign influences. Foreign princes were brought to Egypt to be raised in the royal household before returning to rule the conquered lands. Foreign princesses entered the royal harem and produced potential royal heirs. Foreign slaves toiled in the fields and quarries and temples and palaces, and even in private homes. Foreign products and foreign practices found a ready reception, especially among the stylish and well-to-do Theban nobility. As a result, foreign languages were increasingly being spoken on Egyptian soil, foreign literatures were being read, foreign myths were being recounted, and with them came new vocabulary and new ideas and even new gods. Egypt was still Egypt, but it was also at the center of a cosmopolitan and increasingly international culture, which would change Egypt profoundly, and not entirely for the better.
Egyptian religion.
At this point, we must interrupt our survey of Egyptian history to discuss the development of Egyptian religion, for it is at this point in Egypt's history that historical events, for the first time, cease to determine theology and instead become determined by it. 0.52 The origins of Egyptian religion, like the origins of most things Egyptian, can only be deduced second-hand from the statements of classical authors, who were as far removed from those early events as they themselves are from us, and from the scattered remains uncovered by modern archaeologists. As mentioned above, the pre-dynastic period already exhibited some typically Egyptian religious practices in rudimentary form, notably reed hut shrines devoted to local totemic deities, and separate cemeteries in which the dead were buried facing the west, in company with personal possessions or offerings. This suggests that even in the prehistoric era, there was already a widespread worship of distinct local gods and a widespread belief in an afterlife located somewhere toward the setting sun. Two features of Egyptian religion which would endure, at least iconographically, until the very end. The earliest Egyptians seem to have represented their gods by means of fetishes which they carried about as tribal standards. Feathers, flags, arrows, stuffed or modeled birds and animals, even fossilized mollusks. At the same time, or perhaps a little later, these dead forms were supplemented with living ones chosen from among the Nile Valley's vast profusion of fauna. Crocodiles, jackals, lions, falcons, vultures, beetles, ibises, baboons, bulls, rams, geese, and many more, each, like the inanimate fetishes, associated with a particular tribe or locale. That the Egyptians were still thinking in these terms even into the dynastic era is confirmed by the very names of the early kings of the Archaic period: scorpion, catfish, falcon, snake, as well as by their ceremonial palettes and mace heads, which clearly show the tribal standards being carried into battle and the totemic deities fighting on behalf of their clients. By the end of the First Dynasty, the purely fetishistic and theriomorphic representations of the Egyptian deities had begun to recede into the background, and anthropomorphic or mixed representations took their place. It is at this point that we first encounter the animal-headed humanoid figures which remain the primary representation of deity through most of Egyptian history, and which, several millennia later, so grievously offended Greco-Roman sensibilities. It is clear, however, that long before this change of representation took place, the Egyptians were already worshipping the high gods who dominated Egyptian religion in the dynastic era: Ra and Hathor, Osiris and Isis, Horus and Seth, Anubis, Neith, Ptah, Min, Thoth, and all the rest. In any evaluation of Egyptian religion, therefore, it is necessary to distinguish between the physical symbols, or iconographic representations of the gods, and the abstract conceptions of deity for which these representations stood. The former could be, and often were, crudely physical and even ridiculous, especially to the eyes of outsiders. The latter, however, could reach heights of subtlety and sophistication which compare favorably with those of any other faith, ancient or modern. As the tribes of Egypt coalesced into regional powers and ultimately into a single nation, the worship of some divinities began to spread beyond their local domains and take root in the country at large. In some cases, this was accomplished by simple syncretism. Thus, all falcon gods tended to be seen as manifestations of Horus. Most gods of the dead were identified with Osiris, and many goddesses were assimilated in one way or another to Hathor, and in other cases, several formerly distinct cults were amalgamated by the assertion of family relationships. Thus, Hathor became the consort of Ra, Horus became the son of Osiris, and at Thebes, the triad of Amun, Mut, and Khans was worshipped as father, mother, and son. Some gods and goddesses came to be seen as the patrons of particular activities and/or as personifications of universal natural forces. Thus, Ptah was the patron of all craftsmen, and hence also the master craftsman who fashioned the world. Ra was the sun which shines upon the whole world from highest heaven, and hence also the ruler of all he surveyed from that vantage point. Thoth was the patron of writing and the sciences, but also the moon who measures out time, and hence the divine scribe who determines the destiny of mortals and records the verdict when their hearts are weighed after death. Most often, however, it was the political hegemony of a particular city or the dramatic success of a particular royal house which caused devotion to its patron deity to spread throughout the nation. As we have already seen, this was how Amun himself became the supreme ruler of all Egypt during the New Kingdom. Predictably, the most important deities tended to be those who were associated with Egypt's most powerful and most prestigious cities: Ptah of Memphis, Ra of Heliopolis, Thoth of Kemenu, Greek Hermopolis, the city of Hermes, and much later, Amun of Thebes. Equally predictably, it was the cosmogonies crafted at these great centers which dominated the religious thought of Egypt throughout its history. Foremost of these was the cosmogony of Heliopolis, the city of the sun. In this version, creation began with the god Atum, completion/fullness/perfection, who resided alone in the dark, empty waters of Nun, primordial chaos. Atum then generated two hypostases from himself: Shu, the principle of dry air or luminosity and therefore of stability and preservation, and his sister Tefnut, the principle of moist air or darkness and therefore of change and decay. Shu and Tefnut then gave rise to Geb and Nut, sky, whom Shu separated by placing 4 pillars between them, thereby creating an air-filled void in the midst of the primordial waters, within which further creation could proceed. As the waters drained away from the surface of Geb, a mound appeared, just as land emerges from the annual inundation when the Nile begins to recede. This mound, of course, was held to be the very ground on which Heliopolis would later stand. From the shallows surrounding this mound, or perhaps from a pool upon the mound itself, a lotus emerged, and from this lotus, Atum manifested himself for the first time as Ra, the god of the sun. Thus arose the world as we know it, land beneath, sky above, air and moisture between, with the primordial waters surrounding everything else, above and below. And atop it all, circling perpetually, was Ra in his boat, flanked by his entourage of divine offspring and hypostases, including the personifications of royal attributes which we have already encountered above. Hu, authoritative utterance; Sia, understanding; Heka, creative power; and, most important of all, Ma, truth/justice/order. The cosmogony of Hermopolis was a variation on the same theme. As before, creation began with the waters of chaos and the mound of creation. But in the Hermopolitan version, instead of a single primordial deity, there was the Ogdoad, four mated pairs of deities representing the attributes of the watery abyss. These came together to generate a cosmic egg, which was placed upon the primordial mound, although of course in this version the mound was located at the future site of Hermopolis, and from this egg was born the creator deity. Originally, this creator god may have been Thoth, the patron of Hermopolis. Later, under the influence of the Heliopolitan version, the name of Atum was inserted, and Thoth was demoted to a subordinate position as the creator's right-hand man. A third cosmogony, that of Memphis, was centered on that city's patron deity, Ptah. In the earliest versions, it is likely that Ptah himself was the creator god, but once again the growing influence of Heliopolis caused the name of Atum to be substituted for that of the local deity. At Memphis, however, instead of demoting the local god to the rank of Atum's lieutenant as the Hermopolitans did, the Memphites raised him even higher. Atum, they said, had indeed created the gods, but it was Ptah who created Atum. In fact, in this version, Ptah was equated with the primeval mound itself, this time of course located in Memphis, from which all other things came into existence. Unique to this cosmogony as well was the mode of creation. For unlike the creator deities of the other cosmogonies, Ptah created merely by speaking things into existence. Every word of the god came about through what the heart devised and the tongue commanded. Despite their blatant contradictions, all these competing cosmogonies, and other lesser ones as well, seem to have been considered by the Egyptians to be simultaneously true, or, more accurately, each of them was viewed as a poetic expression of some aspect of the truth that lay behind them all. The practice of spotlighting a different city and a different deity in each local cosmogony has often led Egyptologists to conclude that these disparate beliefs arose independently in the city-states of the pre-dynastic period, and that they were imperfectly merged by eclectic borrowing or deliberate systematization once political unification was achieved. Others, however, have suggested just the opposite, that in the pre-dynastic period there existed a kind of pan-Egyptian orthodoxy, which later received different emphases and local coloration as it was elaborated over time in the individual nomes. Either way, it is clear that the Heliopolitan version was always first among equals, and that it affected other cosmogonies much more than it was affected by them. The motive and mechanism for this Heliopolitan ascendancy was of course the kingship. As we have already seen, Horus the falcon god was the tutelary deity of the earliest kings of a united Egypt. As the soaring hawk who flies above all and sees all, he was a fitting image of universal monarchy. But the sun travels the same celestial paths as the hawk, and in its own way is perhaps an even more evocative image for the king as the source of all life and the repository of all power. Furthermore, by a happy coincidence, or perhaps by Meni's own design, the seat of the sun's worship in Heliopolis was not far from Meni's new capital of Memphis, and no doubt this geographical proximity played its part. It is no surprise then that Horus was very early identified with Ra under the name of Ra-Heru Akhti, Ra, the Horus of the two horizons, one of the most pervasive and enduring deities in all of Egyptian history. It is also no surprise that the kings of Egypt exerted every effort to ally themselves formally with the cult of the sun god and to make themselves its primary beneficiaries. Already at the beginning of the Second Dynasty, we find an Egyptian king calling himself Ra-Neb, which means Ra is Lord. The kings of the Third Dynasty showed their devotion to Ra by building the first pyramid-shaped tombs, a practice which continued in one form or another throughout the rest of Egyptian history. These mimicked the sacred Ben-Ben stone of Heliopolis, which represented the first sunrise over the mound of creation. Beginning with Jedefra in the Fourth Dynasty, Every king of Egypt was formally styled as a son of the sun and given a separate son of Ra name as part of his official titulary. The kings of the 5th dynasty sponsored the construction of at least 5 monumental solar temples on the west bank of the Nile, a few miles from Memphis. And it was at the end of the 5th dynasty and on into the 6th that the solar-oriented pyramid texts began to be inscribed as mortuary texts in the royal pyramids. After 6 centuries of this kind of royal patronage, the worship of Ra was securely established for all time as the premier cult in all of Egypt, and its myth of the sun god's first rising from the primordial mound in the waters of chaos, and his consequent lordship over all creation, ultimately provided the theological glue which held together all the other disparate aspects of Egyptian religion and therefore Egyptian society.
Mot, abstract concept and beneficent deity.
As we have already mentioned, one component of this Heliopolitan glue was the concept of Mot. A great deal of scholarly ink has been spilled on this subject, and we cannot go into all the details of the various controversies that have resulted, but at least we can trace the main outlines of what Mot meant to the Egyptians themselves. The Egyptian word Ma'at made its first written appearance during the Archaic period as the term for straightness or evenness. Its earliest representation was a picture of the raised platform upon which Pharaoh's throne rested. Subsequently personified as a goddess, Ma'at was represented, for reasons still unknown, as a woman with an ostrich feather on her head, or even by the feather standing alone. As early as the Old Kingdom, she already had her own cult with priests and prophets, and temples to Ma'at are already attested by the Middle Kingdom. In the Heliopolitan mythology of the coffin texts, she was identified with Tefnut, the sister wife of Shu. As such, she was not only present at the creation, but in fact provided the principle according to which that creation was carried out. The principle of order. Just as the geography of the Nile Valley had led the Egyptians to adopt a fundamentally dualistic view of the world, so the valley's extraordinarily stable climate and ecology had led them to view stability as the essence of an ordered cosmos and the regular cycles of nature. The alternation of day and night, the waxing and waning of the moon, and above all, the rise and fall of the Nile, had led them to adopt a view of change which was fundamentally cyclic rather than linear. In their view, the proper functioning of the cosmos had been established by the gods, and above all by the creator god, in the Zp Tipwai, or first time, the time immediately after creation, when Ra himself walked the earth as its king. It was during this time that Mot came down from heaven to inaugurate an earthly paradise. Mot descended to the earth in their time and fraternized with the gods. Abundant food was in the bellies of men. There was nothing wrong in the country. No crocodile did snatch away. There was no sting of a serpent in the time of the primordial gods. Ma came from the sky in their time and joined those living on earth. The country was in abundance, the bellies were filled. There was no year of famine in the two lands. Walls did not fall, thorn did not prick in the time of the ancestor gods. But Ra eventually grew old and returned to the heavens, to be succeeded on the throne by a descending series of beings, lesser gods, demigods, spirits, and finally the human sons of Ra, who ruled as kings over Egypt in the dynastic era. It was these kings who were supposed to perpetuate the rule of Mot on earth for all time, by maintaining in every arena the cosmic balance of cyclic repetition and eternal stability, whose prototype was that first time, in which all things had their origin. But just as the cosmos could only exist because Ra had brought order out of the chaos of the primeval waters and continued to maintain that order from day to day, so the world of men could only continue in peace and prosperity if the king, and those whom he ruled, kept at bay the forces of chaos here below. These manifested themselves in many ways: plagues and natural disasters, invasions and insurrections, crime and immorality, famine and drought. In the mind of the Egyptian, such things were never a proper part of the natural functioning of the universe. They were, rather, consequences of the premeditated malice of the forces of chaos and destruction, which were always lurking in the shadows, ready to pounce if the upholders of Mot failed to carry out their duties. Hence, it was both the right and the duty of every king, as the primary facilitator and executor of Mot in the human order, to suppress wrongdoing and destroy falsehood by every means at his disposal, propitiating the gods, repelling invaders, smiting rebels, suppressing crime, ameliorating famine, destroying predatory animals, and enforcing justice among everyone who lived in the land of Egypt, whether great or small, rich or poor, so that under his rule Egypt might flourish, as in primeval times, by means of the designs of Ma, Osiris, and Egyptian mortuary religion. Of all the high gods of Egypt, only Osiris seems originally to have stood entirely outside the Heliopolitan system of thought. So much so, in fact, that the tension between the solar and Osirian schemes continued in various forms all through the dynastic era. Point 7. Indeed, it would be hard to imagine two religions with more widely contrasting psychologies and aesthetics. Ra, after all, was a god of life and light who resided in the heavens, while Osiris was a god of death and darkness who resided under the earth. Even the demographics were different. The cult of Ra was an elitist religion imposed from above by royal fiat in concert with the priesthood of Heliopolis, while the cult of Osiris seems to have been a people's religion, springing up from popular fertility rites and a universal yearning for the kind of life after death which the cyclic renewal of nature seemed to offer. The opposition between the two faiths is clearly expressed in the pyramid texts, when the deified king is received into the heavens by the sky goddess, Nut. Open up your place in the sky among the stars of the sky, for you are the lone star, the companion of Hu. Look down upon Osiris when he governs the spirits, for you stand far off from him. You are not among them, and you shall not be among them. Thus the king, who is here identified with Ra, looks down from heaven upon the hapless dead in the underworld of Osiris, where he is assured he himself will never have to go. Death was, of course, the one thing all Egyptians had in common, regardless of rank or ability. But as in all other things, so here also there were distinctions between the king, the nobility, and common folk, distinctions which emerge clearly in the contrasting afterlives expected by these different classes. The king, already divine in this life, was believed to be even more so in the next. Not only did his role as mediator between gods and men not cease with his death, on the contrary, especially in the earlier periods, death marked his transition to full membership in the divine college, where he was presumed to continue his efforts on behalf of his people. This transformation was effected by a massive body of magical spells and rituals, which must already have been ancient, long before the dynastic era. Indeed, its origins must go back to a time when human sacrifice and even cannibalism were still widely practiced, as the vestiges of those practices in dynastic times make all too clear. The most dramatic example comes from the early dynastic era, when the retainers of the great kings were killed in mass during the royal funeral rites and buried next to the royal tombs so that they might go into the next world with their lords, thereby ensuring both the king's continuing dominance in the next life and their own immortality as part of his entourage. The common people, on the other hand, could expect no such access to the celestial realms. Their bodies were committed not to the great tombs of the kings, but to simple graves hacked out of the earth, and their souls were believed to live out eternity in the underworld kingdom of Osiris. Inevitably, however, the beliefs of the people seeped into the religious conceptions of their masters, and slowly the two systems began to converge. Already in the pre-dynastic period, the cemetery of Abydos, which was thought to contain the tomb of Osiris himself, was one of the most sacred sites in all of Egypt, and many pre-dynastic and archaic period kings situated their own tombs there. In fact, even when the royalty and nobility of subsequent dynasties located their burial places in other parts of Egypt, they often erected a cenotaph at Abydos as well, so that their souls could share in the Osirian sacrifices and participate in the Osirian festivals. By the time the royal mortuary texts first came to be inscribed on the walls of the pyramids at the end of the 5th dynasty, the royal theologians, almost certainly Heliopolitan priests, had crafted a remarkable convergence of solar and Osirian beliefs. Osiris and his mythological associates, his sister wife Isis, his mortal enemy Seth, and Seth's sister wife Nephthys, were all grafted into the sun god's lineage by making them children of Geb and Nut. Horus, the deity of whom the king was the living symbol, became the son of Osiris and Isis. Anubis, perhaps the original patron of Abydos before the universal ascendancy of Osiris as god of the dead, became the son of Nephthys, although whether by Seth or by Osiris was disputed. And most important of all, the king in death was himself identified with the fallen Osiris, and his ascension to the skies with Osiris's revivification. The result was simultaneously a masterpiece of sacred drama and an exceedingly effective piece of political propaganda centered around the royal succession. Just as Osiris, the good king and heir of Ra who brought peace and prosperity to mankind, was slain by Seth, the personification of evil and chaos, so also the good king and son of Ra, who had done Mot for Egypt, had fallen prey to the forces of death and destruction. But just as Osiris's body was restored to wholeness, and Osiris himself raised to new life by Isis and Thoth and Anubis, so that he might become a great power in the other world, so also the king's body would be mummified, and the king raised to new life by the priests in the sacred rites, that he too might become a god among gods. And perhaps even more important, just as Horus, the son of Osiris, had avenged his father against Seth to claim his father's throne, so the king's son and successor would avenge his father against the forces of chaos here on earth by succeeding to the throne of Egypt and once again restoring the balance, stability, and order of Mot. Rejoice, you entire land, the happy time has come. A Lord has arisen in all countries, and orderliness has descended to its proper place. The king of Upper and Lower Egypt, possessor of millions of years, great of kingship like Horus, who overwhelms Egypt with festivals, son of Ra, most beneficent of all kings. Every righteous man, come and see. Mot has quelled falsehood, evildoers are fallen upon their faces, all greedy are forsaken. The water stands and does not subside, the inundation lifts high, the gods are content and pleased, and one lives in laughter and wonder. Such was the myth that sustained the kingship for 3 millennia. It not only lay behind the pyramid texts and all subsequent mortuary texts of ancient Egypt, it also was reenacted at the enthronement of every new king and was played out for public consumption in the annual festival of Osiris at Abydos. The collapse of the kingship at the end of the Old Kingdom and its reconstitution as a somewhat less potent force in the Middle Kingdom made it possible for the mortuary religion of Egypt to become similarly decentralized. No longer were the pyramid texts for royalty alone. Now, in an updated and expanded version we call the coffin texts, they began to be used by the nobility as well, and were inscribed on the coffins of the upper classes as a traveler's guide to the other world. Later, during the New Kingdom, an even wider democratization took place, with derivative versions of these same texts being written on papyrus and placed even in the modest tombs of the middle class. These are the works which have come to be known, somewhat erroneously, as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. Eternal bliss was now within reach of anyone, as long as they could afford the required mummification, the services of a priest to carry out the ceremonies, a decent tomb, and a copy of the necessary spells. After preserving the body, performing the burial ceremonies, and furnishing a copy of the spells necessary for survival in the other world, it was necessary to provide regular offerings for the dead to consume. After all, if the deceased was in some sense still alive, and if that life was tied to the well-being of the mummified body, then it logically followed that he or she would still need some sort of sustenance in the form of food and drink. For the poor, such sustenance might mean no more than a couple of jars of provisions laid in the grave with them. For the rich, it meant creating a perpetual endowment to pay for regular mortuary offerings and the services of a priest to present those offerings at the door of the tomb. According to the instruction of Harjadef, such arrangements were so important for the welfare of the deceased that the priest who carried them out should be considered more profitable to you than your own son. Prefer him even to your own heir. In between the rich who could afford such costly endowments, Harjef was, after all, a king's son, and the poor who could afford almost nothing were those who could not pay for perpetual care but might at least enjoy its virtual equivalent. This could be done either magically through the offerings illustrated on the walls of their tombs, or vicariously through a cenotaph erected at Abydos or some other place where offerings to the gods were reverted for the use of the dead. The New Kingdom cult temple. Other than the kingship and the necessary rites of passage attending death, The single most important and most enduring element of Egyptian religion was the universal role of the great temples. In earliest times, the Egyptian tribal deities were worshipped in simple shrines where the local chieftain or his representative made offerings to the god. This apparently included the sacrifice of specially selected human beings, most notably prisoners of war, a practice which was continued at least symbolically and perhaps literally even into the New Kingdom and beyond. As we have already mentioned, over time these primitive early shrines grew larger and more complex, with the simple reed huts of the pre-dynastic period being replaced with permanent structures made first of brick and then of stone. Here, too, the conservatism of the Egyptian mind can be discerned, for little was lost as the design moved from one stage to another. Rather, the older features were enclosed, augmented, multiplied, and enhanced by the use of newer materials and the addition of newer features in front of them and around them. The result, to which we have already alluded, was the standardized New Kingdom cult temple. The ultimate expression of this paradigm was the great Temple of Amun at Thebes, but the same design can be discerned almost everywhere throughout Egypt. An elaborate processional causeway leading to the temple entrance. A mud brick enclosure wall surrounding not only the temple itself, but its auxiliary buildings, a sacred lake, and the temple gardens. A huge gateway flanked by fluttering flags, gold-tipped obelisks, and fortress-like pylons. An open courtyard surrounded by decorated pillars. A roofed hall further in, with wall-to-wall pillars shaped like papyrus and lotus plants, symbolizing the mound of creation. And at the very back, in perpetual darkness, a granite version of the ancient reed hut shrine, wherein resided the statue of the god. It was here, in the Holy of Holies at the very back of the temple complex, that the high priest, as the king's personal representative, performed the daily rites in which the statue of the deity was bathed, clothed, fed, and propitiated. The feeding of the god especially was an important part of the cult, not because the god needed food, but rather because this was a way of offering ma back to those from whom it originally came. There is scarcely an Egyptian temple that does not include among its many representations of cult scenes the offering of Ma'at. The king, who, when in the presence of the gods, is the representative of the entire world of humanity, holds up and presents a figure of Ma'at. As is demonstrated by the daily temple ritual, every material thing that is presented in the cult, such as bread, beer, incense, and so forth, can be identified with Ma'at. The offering of Ma'at therefore summarizes in a highly charged image everything that cult, offering, and response to the god's actions signify. The officiant's restrained gesture of holding up Ma'at in visible form to the gods constitutes a sign that the world of mankind and all the constantly endangered and fragile relationships and connections on which it depends are in order, just as they were at the time of creation. The gods do not need material gifts, but they do need human response to their existence. They want to be experienced in the hearts of men, for only then does their work of creation acquire its lasting significance. Ma'at, which came from the gods at creation, returns to them from the hands of men. It symbolizes the partnership of God and man, which is brought to fruition in Egyptian religion.